In the spring of 1944, the war on the Eastern Front was entering a decisive phase. After the catastrophic defeats of German forces at Stalingrad and Kursk, and following the massive Soviet offensives of 1943, the balance of power had shifted steadily in favor of the Red Army. By early 1944, Soviet troops had liberated much of Ukraine and advanced toward the borders of Romania, a vital ally of Germany since 1941. The region around the city of Iași and the town of Târgu Frumos in northeastern Romania assumed growing importance, both strategically and politically. The battles fought there in April and May would later be remembered as among the bloodiest encounters in this sector, though they remain less known than the larger operations on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's objectives were shaped by Joseph Stalin's determination to push the Wehrmacht out of Eastern Europe and to bring Romania within the Soviet sphere of influence. Romania's significance extended beyond its geography. Its oil fields at Ploiești were the principal source of petroleum for the German war machine, while its rail lines and river routes connected Axis positions in the Balkans with the Eastern Front. For Stalin and the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, forcing Romania's exit from the war and occupying its territory would both deprive Germany of crucial resources and open a gateway toward the Balkans and Central Europe. Germany, under Adolf Hitler's direct oversight, recognized the danger. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht had been forced to abandon vast stretches of Soviet territory, but remained determined to hold the Romanian front. Hitler's strategic thinking was dominated by the need to defend the Ploiești oil fields at all costs. To that end, he ordered German forces, particularly elite armored divisions, to reinforce the Romanian army. The German 8th Army, commanded by General Otto Wöhler, took charge of operations in the area, supported by Romanian troops under Marshal Ion Antonescu. The German command considered Romania not only a resource base, but also a critical defensive shield against further Soviet penetration into southeastern Europe. The Red Army prepared for its next major push after the successful Uman-Bodeșani offensive in March-April 1944, which brought Soviet forces to the Prut River. The Second Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, concentrated its forces near Iași and along the approaches to Târgu Frumos. Soviet estimates suggested that Axis defenses in Romania were fragile and that a determined strike could bring about a rapid breakthrough. However, German and Romanian forces were not as weak as anticipated. The Wehrmacht deployed experienced armored units, including the Grossdeutschland Division and the 24th Panzer Division, supported by Romanian infantry divisions. These formations, though strained, were battle-hardened and equipped with tanks such as the Panzer and the Panther, which still outmatched much of the Soviet armor in direct engagements. For Romania, the situation was increasingly precarious. By 1944, public sentiment was divided between loyalty to the alliance with Germany and growing war weariness after years of heavy losses. Romanian forces had suffered devastating casualties on the Eastern Front, particularly at Stalingrad, and morale was fragile. Yet Antonescu's regime remained committed to the Axis alliance, both out of fear of Soviet occupation and under the weight of German political and military pressure. Romanian troops were tasked with defending their homeland against an advancing Soviet army that claimed to be liberating territory once part of Greater Romania, but had been ceded to the USSR in 1940 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The civilian population of northeastern Romania found itself on the edge of a vast clash of armies. The people of Iași, Târgu Frumos, and surrounding villages had already endured years of mobilization, requisitions, and shortages. As the front line approached, they faced aerial bombardments, forced evacuations, and the fear of battles fought across their fields and homes. For many civilians, allegiance was secondary to survival, as villages were alternately occupied by Soviet and Axis forces in the shifting tides of battle. By April 1944, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither side could ignore. The Red Army sought to test Axis defenses, probe for weaknesses, and secure a bridgehead into Romania. The German-Romanian command aimed to stabilize the front, inflict heavy losses on Soviet attackers, and protect critical resources. Intelligence assessments on both sides were incomplete and sometimes misleading. The Soviets underestimated the strength and mobility of German armored reserves, while the Germans struggled to predict the timing and direction of Soviet offensives. This convergence of military necessity, strategic resources, political calculation, and human vulnerability created the conditions for the battles of Târgu Frumos. What followed in late April and early May 1944 was a sequence of engagements that, while overshadowed by larger operations elsewhere, proved pivotal in demonstrating the continuing resilience of the German-Romanian defense and in shaping the next phase of the war in southeastern Europe. The events about to unfold would test the endurance of armies and civilians alike, leaving behind a legacy of destruction and uncertainty as both sides prepared for the decisive campaigns to come. In late April 1944, the Soviet High Command authorized a series of probing attacks in northeastern Romania to assess Axis defenses and, if possible, to open a direct path toward the interior of the country. The Second Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Ivan Konev, directed its forces toward the towns of Iași and Târgu Frumos, both critical junctions on the road network that connected northern Romania with the capital Bucharest. Soviet forward elements consisting primarily of the 27th Army under General Trofimenko, and armored support from the 2nd Tank Army, led by General Semyon Bogdanov, moved across the Prut River into Romanian territory. These units numbered approximately 12,000 men, supported by more than 300 tanks and significant artillery assets. The German response was immediate. The 8th Army under General Otto Wöhler, supported by Romanian forces commanded by General Gheorghe Avramescu, rushed reinforcements into the threatened sector. The elite Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, was deployed near Târgu Frumos, while Romanian infantry divisions provided defensive depth along secondary positions. The Axis forces in the area totaled around 8,000 German and Romanian troops, with nearly 200 tanks and assault guns, as well as strong concentrations of field artillery. Although numerically inferior, the German-Romanian defense enjoyed well-prepared positions and flexible command coordination. The first clashes occurred on 24 April when Soviet vanguards pushed into the countryside surrounding Târgu Frumos. Villages in the vicinity, such as WW2 became the scene of bitter fighting as local Romanian units attempted to delay the advance. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with many forced to flee their homes as artillery bombardments destroyed crops and dwellings. Despite stiff resistance, Soviet spearheads managed to enter Târgu Frumos itself on 27 April, encountering only scattered defenders. For a brief period, the town appeared to have fallen under Soviet control. German countermeasures were swift. On 28 April, von Manteuffel ordered a concentrated counterattack by the Großdeutschland Division. Panther and Panzer IV tanks, supported by mechanized infantry and Romanian detachments, advanced in coordinated assaults against the Soviet forces inside the town. Street fighting broke out, with buildings and squares contested at close quarters. The Soviet troops, surprised by the speed and scale of the German counterstroke, were forced to withdraw from Târgu Frumos after suffering heavy losses. Axis accounts describe dozens of Soviet tanks destroyed in the process, while Soviet records acknowledge setbacks, but emphasize the resistance of their infantry under difficult conditions. The recapture of Târgu Frumos demonstrated the effectiveness of German armored reserves in halting Soviet breakthroughs. However, the Soviets did not abandon their objectives. Konev ordered renewed efforts along the entire sector, hoping to stretch Axis lines and find a weak point. In early May, fresh Soviet attacks were launched, involving both the 27th and 40th Armies, with additional tank brigades reinforcing the offensive. These moves confirmed that the struggle for northeastern Romania would not be a brief engagement, but the beginning of a sustained contest for control of the approaches to the Carpathians and the Danube Basin. The opening phase of the battle revealed the strengths and weaknesses on both sides. The Red Army demonstrated its capacity to advance rapidly across rivers and seize towns, but it also revealed difficulties in coordinating large-scale armored operations in hilly terrain with limited road networks. The German-Romanian forces showed that, despite being outnumbered, well-trained armored divisions could launch effective counterattacks and regain lost ground. For civilians in the area, the sudden shifts in control meant renewed uncertainty, as one day's occupation by Soviet units could be followed by the return of German and Romanian troops the next. As April ended, both armies regrouped for what would become a far more intense phase of operations. The Axis command prepared defensive belts around key positions, while the Soviet command shifted resources for a concentrated push. The clash at Târgu Frumos was no longer a local skirmish, but a test of strength with broader implications for the course of the war in southeastern Europe. Following the Axis recapture of Târgu Frumos at the end of April 1944, both sides reassessed their strategies. For the Soviet Second Ukrainian Front, the initial attempt to break through towards central Romania had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Marshal Ivan Konev and his staff therefore sought to refine their operational plan, believing that renewed pressure with greater coordination might overwhelm the defenders. For the German and Romanian forces, the fighting confirmed that Soviet intentions extended far beyond limited probes. The battles around Iași and Târgu Frumos represented a determined effort to penetrate the northern flank of Romania. The Soviet strategic objective was twofold: to drive a wedge between German and Romanian forces by seizing key communication hubs, and to force a retreat that would expose the interior of Romania to further advance. Konev redeployed the 2nd Tank Army, supported by the 27th Army and elements of the 40th Army, concentrating roughly 16,000 men, over 400 tanks, and strong artillery groupings. Soviet planners believed that sustained frontal pressure, combined with armored thrusts around the flanks, could dislodge the German-Romanian defense. Soviet intelligence assessments suggested that the Axis command had been weakened by overextension and could not resist multiple well-timed blows. German command viewed the situation differently. General Otto Wöhler, aware of Soviet numerical superiority, emphasized the importance of mobile defense. The Grossdeutschland Division, with its Panther battalions, remained the cornerstone of German strength in the sector. It was supported by the 24th Panzer Division, Romanian 1st Guards Division, and several infantry formations tasked with holding secondary lines. The Axis strategy combined static defense in depth with rapid counterattacks by armored reserves whenever Soviet spearheads threatened to break through. Hitler personally reiterated his demand that Romania must not be abandoned, reinforcing the commitment to hold the region regardless of cost. Romanian forces bore a significant share of the burden. Infantry divisions manned long stretches of the line, often with limited heavy weapons and outdated equipment. They were tasked with delaying Soviet infantry and absorbing artillery fire, while German armored units counterattacked at decisive points. Romanian commanders recognized the difficulties but remained bound to the German alliance by both political obligations and the immediate threat of Soviet occupation. For many Romanian soldiers, the defense of their homeland was a personal as well as strategic necessity, even as war fatigue and heavy casualties eroded morale. The logistical dimension played a crucial role in shaping the contest. Soviet supply lines stretched across the recently liberated regions of Moldova and Bessarabia, relying on damaged railways and roads that had to support large armored formations. Artillery ammunition and fuel shortages limited the sustainability of continuous assaults. The German and Romanian defenders, by contrast, were closer to their supply depots in central Romania, though Allied air raids on infrastructure, particularly on Ploiești, increasingly disrupted Axis logistics. Maintaining steady flows of fuel for armored divisions was a constant challenge for the German command. Propaganda on both sides reflected the stakes of the battle. Soviet newspapers emphasized the liberation of Romanian territory lost in 1940, portraying the offensive as a continuation of the struggle to reclaim Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. German and Romanian state media, in turn, highlighted the defense of Romanian soil against Bolshevik invasion, presenting the joint stand as proof of Axis resilience. Civilians caught between the lines received little clarity from either narrative. For them, the battle was defined by bombardments, displacement, and the uncertainty of survival. Public sentiment within Romania was complex. In Bucharest and other major cities, rumors of Soviet advances spread unease. Some saw potential in a Soviet breakthrough as an opportunity to end the alliance with Germany, while others feared retribution for Romania's role in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Antonescu's government maintained strict censorship and surveillance, aware that the outcome of battles at Iași and Târgu Frumos could directly influence political stability at home. By the beginning of May 1944, the lines around Târgu Frumos had solidified into a tense stalemate. Soviet artillery barrages preceded renewed attacks, while German and Romanian defenders reinforced their positions with fieldworks, trenches, and fortified strongpoints. The region became a focal point of the Eastern Front, not because of vast territorial changes, but because of the concentration of high-quality forces and the determination of both commands to impose their will. The stage was thus set for the next wave of engagements. Soviet planning sought to unleash coordinated armored strikes designed to break through at multiple points, while the Axis command relied on maneuver and counterpunches to deny the Red Army a decisive success. In the weeks ahead, the battle would escalate into larger, bloodier clashes that tested both military doctrine and the endurance of the troops committed to one of the most intense confrontations in Romania during 1944. On the 2nd May 1944, the Red Army launched a renewed offensive against the Axis lines around Târgu Frumos. Marshal Ivan Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front deployed its forces in a concentrated assault aimed at breaking through the German and Romanian defenses. The 27th Army under General Trofimenko and the 40th Army under General Zhimachenko spearheaded the infantry push, while the 2nd Tank Army, commanded by General Bogdanov, was assigned to exploit any breach with armored thrusts. Soviet forces fielded several hundred tanks, including T-3476, T-3485s, and Su-85 self-propelled guns, supported by dense artillery barrages. The Axis defense was prepared for such a move. The German 8th Army under General Otto Wöhler had established layered defensive lines around key terrain, including the hills and ridges near Târgu Frumos. The Großdeutschland Division, with its Panther tanks, was positioned to act as a mobile reserve, while the 24th Panzer Division and Romanian infantry divisions held entrenched positions. Romanian forces, including the 1st Guards and 6th Infantry Divisions, manned defensive sectors along roads and river crossings, often without adequate armor, but supported by German artillery and anti-tank detachments. The Soviet offensive began with heavy artillery bombardments, designed to soften up Axis defenses. Villages such as Sarca and WWII came under sustained shelling, forcing both Axis troops and civilians to seek shelter. By mid-morning, Soviet infantry and armor surged forward, attempting to overwhelm Romanian units holding the forward lines. In several sectors, the Soviets achieved local penetrations, driving Romanian defenders back from exposed positions. However, German counterattacks quickly moved to contain the breakthroughs. Panther and Panzer IV tanks of the Großdeutschland Division engaged Soviet T-34s in open fields, where range and armor proved decisive. Fighting inside and around Târgu Frumos was intense. Soviet tanks attempted to push into the town, using supporting infantry to clear streets and strong points. German defenders, reinforced by Romanian detachments, fought building to building, employing Panzerfausts and artillery positioned within urban areas. On several occasions, control of certain districts shifted repeatedly within the span of hours. Civilian populations fled or were forced into cellars, caught between Soviet bombardments and Axis counterfire. Despite heavy pressure, the Axis line did not collapse. The German command made effective use of maneuver warfare, striking Soviet spearheads as they extended into narrow corridors of advance. This tactic isolated Soviet forward units from their supporting artillery and allowed German armored groups to encircle and destroy them in piecemeal fashion. Reports indicate that dozens of Soviet tanks were destroyed during these counterstrokes, while Romanian infantry absorbed heavy casualties defending trenches and delaying Soviet infantry assaults. By 4th of May, the scale of the clashes intensified further. Soviet commanders committed additional armored brigades to the battle, hoping to force a breakthrough before German reserves could consolidate. The Axis side responded with concentrated artillery barrages and coordinated infantry armor counterattacks. Hills surrounding Târgu Frumos became contested ground, with both sides recognizing their importance for observation and control of the surrounding valleys. Axis artillery observers used the elevated terrain to direct precise fire on advancing Soviet formations, slowing their momentum. The resilience of the German-Romanian defense surprised Soviet commanders. Although Soviet forces succeeded in pushing back Romanian frontline divisions in some areas, they failed to achieve a decisive rupture. Losses on both sides mounted rapidly. Soviet infantry units endured heavy attrition from German artillery and machine gun fire, while German and Romanian defenders suffered from relentless Soviet pressure and air attacks. The Luftwaffe, though diminished compared to earlier campaigns, provided limited air support with WW190 fighter bombers targeting Soviet tank concentrations. The Red Air Force, deploying Il-2 Sturmovix, struck Axis positions and supply columns, adding another destructive dimension to the struggle. For civilians, the first week of May brought devastation. Entire villages were reduced to ruins by artillery duels, while thousands of residents were displaced. Agricultural production in the region, vital for sustaining local populations, was disrupted as fields became battlegrounds. Livestock was either requisitioned by troops or lost during evacuations. Accounts from the period describe long columns of refugees moving away from the front, burdened with carts and personal belongings, unsure whether Axis or Soviet troops would control their towns by the next day. By the end of the first week of May, the battle line stabilized once again. The Soviets had failed to seize and hold Târgu Frumos, despite committing large armored forces. German and Romanian troops remained in control of the key town and surrounding high ground, though at the cost of significant casualties. The fighting marked one of the rare occasions in 1944 when Soviet offensives were decisively contained in open battle by German-Romanian cooperation. Both sides now prepared for an escalation that would determine whether the Soviet momentum in the region could be sustained or whether the Axis defense could prolong its hold over northeastern Romania. In the days that followed the failed Soviet thrust of early May 1944, the battle around Târgu Frumos entered a phase of escalation. Both sides poured additional men and resources into the contested sector, transforming what had begun as a probing operation into a full-scale confrontation. For the Red Army, the inability to achieve a breakthrough with the initial offensive demanded a rapid reorganization. Marshal Ivan Konev shifted reserves, ordered fresh infantry formations into the line, and demanded renewed attacks by the 2nd Tank Army. The Stavka pressed for decisive results, believing that the front in Romania was vulnerable if attacked with sufficient force. The Axis command, under General Otto Wöhler, understood that the Soviets would not easily abandon their objective. German and Romanian units dug deeper defensive positions around Târgu Frumos, creating a network of trenches, bunkers, and artillery sites. The Grossdeutschland Division was repositioned to cover the most threatened approaches, while the 24th Panzer Division was rotated into reserve for counterattack duties. Romanian formations, including the 4th Infantry and 8th Cavalry Divisions, were tasked with holding extended sectors along rivers and ridges, where terrain could help offset their lack of armored support. By 7th to 8th May, the fighting resumed with renewed intensity. Soviet infantry, supported by massed artillery fire, attacked the Romanian positions along the Siret River Valley. Barrages lasting several hours preceded each assault, devastating trenches and villages alike. In some sectors, Romanian units were forced back, suffering hundreds of casualties in a single day. However, the cost to Soviet troops was equally severe. German artillery observers, stationed on elevated ridges, directed fire that disrupted Soviet concentrations before they could fully deploy. The battles were marked by rapid changes in momentum. When Soviet spearheads managed to push through Romanian lines, German armored counterattacks often followed within hours. Panther tanks and Sturmgeschütz, assault guns, operating in combined formations, struck Soviet columns as they advanced along narrow road networks. In several documented engagements, entire Soviet tank companies were destroyed in ambushes, with burning wrecks blocking roads and hindering reinforcements. Yet, despite these losses, Soviet commanders ordered repeated assaults, determined to wear down the Axis defenders by sheer weight of numbers. Terrain played a crucial role. The region around Târgu Frumos was defined by rolling hills, forests, and river valleys. Open fields offered opportunities for tank duels, but also exposed advancing units to concentrated fire. Villages became strong points fiercely defended by Axis troops, then reduced by Soviet artillery, only to be reoccupied and fortified again. The constant shift of control over small settlements created a destructive cycle, leaving little intact for civilians who had remained behind. Fields planted with spring crops were churned into mud by artillery and tank tracks, ensuring that the agricultural output of the area would be devastated for months. Logistics presented mounting difficulties for both sides. The Soviets struggled to sustain large armored thrusts over damaged roadways, with fuel shortages often forcing tanks to halt or move in staggered waves. Ammunition supply for artillery was equally strained, limiting the duration of bombardments in some sectors. For the Axis forces, the chief concern was maintaining sufficient fuel for their armored reserves. The German command allocated scarce petroleum supplies from Ploiești to sustain counterattack capabilities, while Romanian logistical units worked to keep supply routes open under constant Soviet shelling. The human toll of the escalating battles became increasingly visible. Soviet infantry formations reported battalion-level losses that reduced their strength by half within days. Axis reports acknowledged that Romanian units bore the brunt of Soviet pressure, with some regiments suffering such attrition that replacements were urgently requested. Field hospitals on both sides overflowed with wounded, and evacuation under fire became a daily reality. Civilians were caught in the same crisis. Those who had not fled earlier now faced food shortages, destroyed homes, and the dangers of unexploded ordnance littering fields and streets. Politically, the escalation deepened tensions within Romania. While Antonescu's regime insisted on continued resistance, sections of the Romanian political elite questioned the cost of the alliance with Germany. Each Axis communiqué that announced the repulse of a Soviet attack was contrasted by the visible destruction in the countryside and the heavy losses endured by Romanian troops. In Moscow, meanwhile, propaganda emphasized the Soviet advance as part of a liberation campaign, downplaying setbacks while portraying the battle as a necessary step toward breaking Axis resistance in southeastern Europe. By mid-May, it was clear that the struggle for Târgu Frumos had reached a critical stage. The Red Army had committed significant forces without achieving the decisive breakthrough it sought. The Axis defense had held, but only through constant counterattacks, heavy expenditure of resources, and the sacrifice of both German armored formations and Romanian infantry. The next phase would determine whether the Soviet command could adjust its tactics and sustain pressure, or whether the Axis defense would continue to impose a costly stalemate in this strategically vital sector of the Eastern Front. By the third week of May 1944, the confrontation around Târgu Frumos had reached its peak. After weeks of attritional fighting, both the Soviet Second Ukrainian Front and the German-Romanian Eighth Army committed their strongest available units in a bid to determine control of the region. The battles that unfolded during this period were among the most intense fought in Romania before the final Soviet offensive later that summer. Marshal Ivan Konev's headquarters directed fresh assaults with the 27th and 40th Armies, reinforced by armored elements of the 2nd Tank Army. These forces fielded close to 2,000 men and more than 500 tanks, supported by thousands of artillery pieces. The goal was clear: break the Axis line, seize Târgu Frumos, and open the way toward Iași and ultimately the interior of Romania. Soviet commanders believed that repeated pressure would wear down the German-Romanian defense and that the weight of manpower and materiel could not be resisted indefinitely. General Otto Wöhler and his staff, however, prepared a layered defensive system that relied heavily on mobility. The Grossdeutschland Division, numbering about 18,000 men, with over 200 tanks and assault guns, served as the striking force. It was reinforced by the 24th Panzer Division and multiple Romanian divisions positioned along extended sectors. Romanian troops manned trench systems on the approaches to towns and ridges, acting as a shield behind which German armored units could maneuver. The Axis strategy sought not only to hold ground, but to destroy advancing Soviet formations through carefully timed counterattacks. The peak of the campaign was characterized by massive artillery exchanges. Soviet batteries unleashed preparatory barrages lasting hours, pounding Axis positions and shattering villages. German and Romanian artillery replied with counter-battery fire, concentrating on choke points where Soviet armor was expected to advance. The countryside echoed with constant detonations, turning hills and fields into landscapes of craters. In some engagements, the density of fire exceeded 150 shells per hectare, creating what participants later described as zones of complete devastation. Soviet tank thrusts often followed these bombardments, but they were met by well-coordinated Axis countermeasures. Panther tanks, positioned on ridgelines, engaged T-34s at long range, while Sturmgeschütz III assault guns ambushed Soviet armor from concealed positions in villages and forests. Luftwaffe units, though limited, flew concentrated sorties with WW-87 dive bombers and WW-190 fighter bombers, targeting Soviet supply routes and tank concentrations. The Red Air Force countered with swarms of Il-2 Sturmovix and Yak fighters, leading to intense air battles over the battlefield. The combat in and around Târgu Frumos itself reached extraordinary levels of destruction. Soviet infantry launched repeated assaults into the town, supported by armor that attempted to penetrate narrow streets. Axis defenders fought from fortified buildings, cellars, and barricades, transforming each block into a fortress. The town changed hands multiple times in a matter of days, each transition leaving further ruin. Fires consumed wooden structures, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Civilians who had remained hidden in basements were forced to flee under fire, adding to the waves of displaced people moving southward. Romanian divisions, although less equipped than their German counterparts, played a critical role in holding the extended front. At several points along the Siret Valley and the approaches to Iași, Romanian infantry bore the brunt of Soviet attacks. Their resistance, often with outdated artillery and limited anti-tank weapons, came at a heavy cost. Reports indicate that some regiments were reduced to half strength within a week. Nonetheless, their presence allowed German armored reserves to concentrate against the Soviet spearheads. The human suffering during this stage was severe. Soviet casualty reports, though incomplete, suggest tens of thousands of losses in killed, wounded, and missing, with tank brigades reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Axis losses were likewise heavy, with German units reporting significant depletion of armored vehicles and Romanian divisions suffering catastrophic infantry casualties. Field hospitals operated continuously, with overcrowding and shortages of medical supplies affecting care for both soldiers and civilians. Despite the ferocity of the fighting, the Soviet command failed to secure the decisive breakthrough it sought. The Axis defense, though under immense strain, remained intact. The combination of Romanian determination on the defensive lines and German armored counterattacks prevented the Red Army from exploiting local successes. For Konev's troops, the inability to advance beyond Târgu Frumos represented a major setback, highlighting the challenges of breaking through against concentrated German armored forces even in 1944. By late May, the battlefield around Târgu Frumos had been transformed into a devastated zone of wrecked armor, ruined villages, and exhausted troops. The struggle had consumed immense resources without altering the strategic map. Both sides began to reassess their positions. The Soviets prepared to regroup and shift their focus to larger summer offensives, while the Axis command sought to consolidate defenses in anticipation of the next major Soviet push. The peak of the Târgu Frumos campaign had demonstrated the extraordinary costs of even limited operations and foreshadowed the decisive struggles that lay ahead in Romania. As May 1944 drew to a close, the battle around Târgu Frumos entered a stage defined less by rapid offensives and more by endurance, resistance, and adaptation. After weeks of costly assaults, the Soviet Second Ukrainian Front scaled back its immediate offensive operations, while still probing Axis positions in search of exploitable weaknesses. The Red Army had committed immense forces, but had not achieved the breakthrough that its high command had anticipated. This compelled Soviet commanders to reconsider their methods, improvising tactics to offset the effectiveness of German and Romanian defensive measures. For the Red Army, the most pressing challenge was sustaining offensive momentum under conditions of attrition. Tank brigades that had begun the month with more than 60 vehicles now counted fewer than half that number, with mechanical breakdowns and battlefield losses depleting their strength. Infantry divisions were similarly worn down, many reduced to 2/3 or less of their original complement. Soviet units adapted by rotating battalions to the front in shorter cycles, allowing shattered formations to regroup while fresh troops launched smaller-scale assaults. Engineers played a more prominent role, building pontoon bridges, clearing minefields, and attempting to carve alternate routes for supplies when roads were blocked by wrecks and craters. German and Romanian forces, though holding the line, faced their own pressures. The German Grossdeutschland division had suffered heavy attrition in armor and personnel, yet continued to be the decisive counterattack force. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly to repair damaged Panthers and Panzerreich IVs, cannibalizing parts from destroyed vehicles to keep others operational. Romanian divisions, such as the 1st Guards and 7th Infantry, adapted by reinforcing their trenches with captured Soviet equipment and building deeper defensive belts. Improvised strong points, often based in partially ruined villages, allowed smaller Axis units to resist Soviet pushes for extended periods. One notable feature of this phase was the increasing reliance on local geography. Hills and ridges overlooking valleys became fortified observation posts, directing concentrated artillery fire against Soviet advances. The Soviets, recognizing the difficulty of frontal attacks against these positions, attempted to use night assaults and infiltration tactics. Small groups of Soviet infantry crossed fields under cover of darkness, striking at Romanian trenches in hopes of creating gaps. These attacks achieved limited success, but rarely produced sustained breakthroughs. Civilians continued to bear the consequences of adaptation on both sides. Villagers were forced to assist in constructing fortifications, often requisitioned by whichever army controlled their settlement at the moment. Food shortages grew more severe as crops were trampled by troops or destroyed by shelling. Some civilians resorted to hiding supplies in forests or caves, while others fled southward in long columns of refugees. For those who remained, survival meant enduring repeated changes of control, looting, and the ever-present risk of bombardment. The psychological toll on soldiers was also profound. Soviet troops, despite their determination, faced frustration at repeated failures to secure decisive gains. Political officers worked to sustain morale by emphasizing the broader goals of liberating Romanian territory and striking at the Axis rear. German and Romanian troops, meanwhile, struggled with exhaustion from continuous engagements. Romanian soldiers, in particular, expressed ambivalence. They were fighting on their own soil, but under German command, in a war whose long-term outcome seemed increasingly uncertain. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a mixture of resolve, weariness, and doubts about what would follow if the Soviets eventually broke through. Improvisation extended into logistics. Soviet supply officers sought to improve ammunition delivery by mobilizing local carts and livestock, supplementing overburdened motor transport. Axis units scavenged captured Soviet fuel and shells whenever possible, incorporating them into their defensive system. In some instances, Romanian troops fought with ammunition supplied from Soviet stockpiles captured in earlier engagements, a testament to the resourcefulness forced upon them by scarcity. Air power also adapted to changing conditions. The Luftwaffe, constrained by dwindling resources, concentrated its sorties on critical points, often launching sudden attacks against Soviet tank concentrations before quickly withdrawing. The Red Air Force maintained greater numerical presence, but fuel and maintenance difficulties limited sustained operations. Pilots on both sides became accustomed to fighting over the same devastated terrain day after day, with little room for maneuver beyond the narrow operational sector. By early June, the confrontation settled into a tense stalemate. The Soviets had tested Axis defenses repeatedly without achieving decisive results, while German and Romanian forces had demonstrated that coordinated defense in depth could resist even large-scale assaults. Both sides had adapted, the Soviets by adjusting tactics to conserve strength, and the Axis by deepening fortifications and maximizing the efficiency of dwindling resources. This stage of the battle underscored the capacity of both armies to resist under extreme conditions, but it also highlighted the limits of their endurance. The Red Army recognized that a more comprehensive offensive, coordinated with other fronts, would be required to break Axis power in Romania. For the German and Romanian defenders, each day of holding the line was both a temporary success and a reminder that larger battles loomed ahead. The confrontation at Târgu Frumos had evolved from a sharp clash into a prolonged test of adaptation and resilience, setting the stage for the critical turning points that were soon to follow. By mid-June 1944, the battle for Târgu Frumos reached a critical turning point. Weeks of sustained assaults, counterattacks, and attritional fighting had left both the Red Army and the Axis defenders exhausted. Yet, the strategic balance of the war was shifting. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, increasingly viewed the Târgu Frumos sector not as an isolated battlefield, but as part of a broader campaign plan that would culminate in Operation Bagration in Belarus and a renewed drive into the Balkans. What had begun as a determined attempt to crack Axis lines in northeastern Romania was gradually redefined as a holding engagement, while larger offensives were prepared elsewhere. For Marshal Ivan Konev and the Second Ukrainian Front, the failure to break through in May was sobering. Reports from the front detailed the high losses sustained by tank brigades and infantry corps, the heavy consumption of artillery ammunition, and the inability to secure decisive ground despite multiple large-scale efforts. Soviet planners concluded that the Axis defense, anchored by the Großdeutschland Division and supported by Romanian formations, could not be dislodged without greater forces and coordination. The Soviet command therefore shifted to a more cautious approach, maintaining pressure through limited attacks, reconnaissance in force, and artillery harassment, while conserving resources for the larger summer campaigns. On the Axis side, the turning point was recognized as a defensive success. General Otto Wöhler and his staff reported to Berlin that the German-Romanian front had withstood one of the heaviest Soviet assaults since the beginning of the year. Hitler interpreted the outcome as proof that determined defense and elite armored formations could still halt Soviet offensives, despite the general decline of German power on the Eastern Front. For the Romanian leadership under Marshal Ion Antonescu, the successful defense provided temporary reassurance, but also deepened political dilemmas. The fighting had demonstrated Romania's vulnerability, and Antonescu's government faced the stark reality that future Soviet offensives would only intensify. The military outcome of Târgu Frumos was therefore paradoxical. On the tactical level, the Axis had secured a clear defensive victory. The town remained in German-Romanian hands, and the Soviet advance had been checked. Estimates suggest that the Soviets suffered more than 3,000 casualties and lost hundreds of tanks during the operations, while Axis losses, though significant, were markedly lower in relative terms. Yet, strategically, the broader war continued to tilt in the Soviet Union's favor. The inability of the Red Army to achieve a breakthrough at Târgu Frumos delayed but did not prevent future offensives that would eventually sweep through Romania later in 1944. For civilians in the region, the turning point meant little respite. The front line stabilized, but artillery fire and air raids continued to devastate towns and villages. Many residents of Târgu Frumos returned to find their homes reduced to rubble, while others remained displaced in rural areas, dependent on scarce resources. Agricultural production, already disrupted, collapsed further as fields were mined, livestock requisitioned, and labor diverted to fortification work. The longer the battlefront remained static, the deeper the humanitarian crisis became. Internationally, the outcome at Târgu Frumos was largely overshadowed by preparations for larger operations. Soviet propaganda downplayed the setback, framing the fighting as a temporary phase in a continuous advance westward. German communiques, by contrast, celebrated the battle as evidence of Axis resilience, highlighting the role of German-Romanian cooperation in repelling Soviet mass attacks. In neutral and Allied press coverage, the battle received little attention compared to developments in Italy and the impending Allied landings in Normandy. This lack of recognition contributed to Târgu Frumos becoming one of the lesser-known clashes of the Eastern Front, despite its intensity. Within Romania, the perception of the turning point was more complex. Antonescu's regime emphasized the successful defense as proof of Romania's continuing role as a loyal ally of Germany. Yet many within the Romanian political and military elite interpreted the Soviet setback as only temporary. Secret contacts with Allied representatives had already been initiated by opposition groups in Bucharest, and the persistence of the front near Iași underscored the danger of Romania becoming the next battleground once Soviet resources were redirected southward. By late June, the tempo of operations in the Târgu Frumos sector slowed considerably. Soviet units entrenched themselves along forward positions, conducting reconnaissance and preparing for future offensives. German and Romanian troops consolidated their defenses, repaired fortifications, and attempted to replenish depleted units. The battlefield itself bore witness to the turning point. Wrecked Soviet and German tanks littered the fields. Villages lay abandoned, and the scars of weeks of fighting remained visible across the countryside. The battle for Târgu Frumos had not altered the grand course of the war, but it had revealed much about the capabilities and limitations of both sides in 1944. The Soviets had demonstrated immense offensive power, but also exposed weaknesses in planning and coordination. The Axis had shown defensive resilience, but only by relying on elite formations and at the cost of exhausting their Romanian allies. The turning point at Târgu Frumos thus stood as a moment of temporary stability in a war that was otherwise accelerating toward decisive conclusions elsewhere. As the fighting around Târgu Frumos subsided in late June 1944, both sides turned to consolidation and reassessment. The Red Army, having failed to secure a breakthrough in northeastern Romania, gradually shifted its focus northward, where the massive Operation Bagration was about to be unleashed in Belarus. For the Soviet High Command, the Iași-Târgu Frumos battles had been costly diversions, yielding no significant territorial gains and exposing vulnerabilities in coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. The Soviet leadership concluded that a decisive blow in Romania would have to wait until the summer campaign could bring overwhelming pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. For the Axis, the aftermath carried a different meaning. General Otto Wöhler's 8th Army and Marshal Ion Antonescu's Romanian forces had successfully defended key positions, but the strain of the operation was evident. German armored units such as the Grossdeutschland Division emerged with reduced combat strength, their tank fleets depleted, and many veteran crews lost. Romanian infantry divisions, which had borne the brunt of Soviet assaults, reported staggering casualties. Some regiments were reduced to skeleton formations, forcing emergency drafts and conscription to replenish the ranks. While Berlin praised the defense as a model of cooperation, Bucharest quietly registered the cost in blood and resources. The retreat of Soviet forces from immediate offensive operations did not end the suffering of civilians. The Iași-Târgu Frumos region remained militarized, with both Axis and Soviet artillery continuing to fire intermittently across the front. Villages caught in the contested zone were left in ruins, with rubble-filled streets, destroyed churches, and farmland rendered unusable. Thousands of families remained displaced, seeking shelter further south or in improvised refugee camps. Disease spread among displaced populations, fueled by shortages of clean water and medical care. For many civilians, the so-called lull in fighting was little more than a continuation of hardship under shifting military occupations. Romania's political situation grew increasingly precarious during this period. Antonescu remained committed to the German alliance, emphasizing the success at Târgu Frumos as validation of his policy. Yet discontent within Romania's political and military elites deepened. Opposition figures, including leaders from traditional parties and elements within the monarchy, recognized that Soviet forces would inevitably return in greater strength. Secret negotiations with Allied representatives in neutral countries gained momentum, as Romanian leaders sought a path to end the war before complete destruction overtook their country. The fighting at Târgu Frumos thus served as both a warning and a catalyst, convincing many Romanians that continued reliance on Germany was untenable. For the German High Command, the immediate aftermath of Târgu Frumos offered temporary relief. The front had held, the oil fields of Ploiești remained secure, and the Balkans were shielded for the time being. Yet, German commanders understood the fragility of this success. The defense had required the deployment of elite divisions that could not easily be replaced or reinforced. Moreover, the growing scale of Allied operations in Western Europe and the Soviet buildup on the Central Front meant that Germany faced mounting pressures across all theaters. Târgu Frumos highlighted the Wehrmacht's ability to resist tactically, but also underscored the broader strategic imbalance that was steadily eroding Germany's position. Soviet military doctrine also evolved in response to the setback. The Red Army recognized that localized offensives, even when backed by large tank forces, were insufficient to overcome German defenses anchored by experienced armored units. The lessons of Târgu Frumos were carefully studied by Soviet commanders, influencing the planning of later offensives. When the Red Army returned to Romania in August 1944 during the Iași-Chișinău offensive, it did so with far greater coordination, overwhelming numerical superiority, and the determination to prevent another stalemate. The human consequences of the battle were lasting. For soldiers on both sides, the aftermath was marked by exhaustion and grief. German and Romanian troops who had fought through the urban combat of Târgu Frumos and the surrounding countryside carried the psychological scars of weeks of continuous engagements. Soviet veterans of the battle recalled the intensity of Axis counterattacks and the frustration of seeing objectives slip away after costly advances. For civilians, the ruined landscape was a daily reminder of the destructive capacity of modern war. Many never returned to their homes, resettling in safer regions or integrating into refugee populations elsewhere in Romania. By July 1944, the lines in the Târgu Frumos sector had stabilized. The Axis still held the town and its approaches, while the Soviets withdrew significant formations to concentrate on new offensives. What remained was a devastated battlefield, with abandoned tanks, shattered artillery pieces, and makeshift graves scattered across hills and fields. The Iași-Târgu Frumos battles faded quickly from international headlines, overshadowed by the Allied landings in Normandy and the Soviet triumphs in Belarus. Yet for those who lived through it, the aftermath was unmistakable, a temporary halt in one of the bloodiest clashes fought on Romanian soil, but also a prelude to the decisive battles that would soon engulf the country. The legacy of the battles around Târgu Frumos is complex, shaped by both their immediate impact in 1944 and their longer-term significance in the history of the Eastern Front. At the time, the fighting was overshadowed by larger campaigns, yet the clashes in April-May demonstrated critical dynamics that influenced subsequent operations. The German-Romanian defense revealed that, even late in the war, Axis forces could still repel Soviet offensives when terrain, fortifications, and armored reserves were skillfully employed. For the Soviets, the inability to secure a breakthrough underscored the limits of localized offensives and reinforced the necessity of overwhelming, multi-front operations coordinated at the highest level. In military terms, the Battle of Târgu Frumos became an example of successful defensive warfare. The Grossdeutschland Division, supported by Romanian infantry, was able to inflict disproportionate losses on Soviet armored forces. German after-action reports emphasized the value of tactical flexibility, mobile counterattacks, and combined arms coordination. The battle became a case study within the Wehrmacht for the effectiveness of defense in depth, even under conditions of numerical inferiority. For Romanian forces, the defense highlighted both their resilience and their vulnerabilities. While Romanian divisions played a decisive role in holding extended sectors, their heavy casualties revealed the limits of a force dependent on German armor and command structures. For the Red Army, the legacy was equally instructive. Though costly, the setback at Târgu Frumos provided valuable lessons in preparation for the August 1944 Iași-Chișinău offensive. Soviet planners recognized the need for improved coordination between infantry and armor, better reconnaissance, and overwhelming numerical superiority to ensure success. When the Red Army returned to Romania just months later, it did so with nearly double the strength employed at Târgu Frumos, supported by broader strategic offensives across the Eastern Front. This shift in approach ensured that the next Soviet push into Romania achieved decisive results, leading to the collapse of Axis defenses and Romania's change of sides. Politically, the legacy of Târgu Frumos was profound for Romania. The battle had shown both the possibility of resisting Soviet advances and the inevitable scale of destruction such resistance entailed. Antonescu's regime celebrated the defense as a national success, but many in the Romanian elite interpreted it as a temporary reprieve. The high casualties suffered by Romanian troops deepened dissatisfaction with the alliance with Germany and strengthened opposition movements seeking to negotiate an armistice with the Allies. In hindsight, the battles around Târgu Frumos hastened Romania's eventual decision to break with Germany, as the cost of continued fighting on Axis terms became unsustainable. For civilians, the legacy was one of devastation and displacement. Villages destroyed in the fighting were slow to recover, with agricultural output in the region significantly reduced for the remainder of the war. Families uprooted by the battle faced years of hardship, whether as refugees in other parts of Romania or under Soviet occupation after August 1944. Oral histories collected after the war reflect the lingering trauma of bombardments, evacuations, and the destruction of entire communities caught in the crossfire. In the broader context of World War II, Târgu Frumos occupies a paradoxical place. It was not a decisive campaign in itself, yet it shaped the trajectory of later operations. For the Axis, it represented one of the last successful defensive actions on the Eastern Front, before the tide of war swept irreversibly westward. For the Soviets, it was a reminder that final victory required comprehensive planning and the concentration of overwhelming resources. For Romania, it was both a battlefield defense and a political warning, demonstrating that the war on its soil could only end through a fundamental change of alignment. Historians continue to debate the scale and significance of the battle. Some emphasize its tactical importance as a demonstration of German defensive capability in 1944, while others view it as a footnote to the much larger strategic shifts that followed with Operation Bagration and the Iași-Chișinău offensive. The relatively limited coverage of Târgu Frumos in wartime propaganda and post-war accounts has contributed to its relative obscurity, despite the fact that tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians experienced its devastation firsthand. Today, the memory of the battle remains localized. Memorials and cemeteries in the Iași and Târgu Frumos region testify to the scale of losses, while scholarly studies have gradually restored the event to the broader narrative of the Eastern Front. For Romania, the battle is remembered as part of a sequence of struggles that culminated in the dramatic reversal of August 1944, when the country abandoned the Axis alliance. For Germany, it stands as one of the last tactical victories achieved before the collapse of its eastern defenses. For the Soviet Union, it is recalled as a costly but instructive engagement, shaping the methods that would bring ultimate success in the Balkans. The legacy of Târgu Frumos, therefore, is not one of decisive conquest or collapse, but of lessons learned, sacrifices endured, and the shifting momentum of a war that was entering its final and most destructive phase. In the spring of 1944, on the hills and fields of northeastern Romania, the clash of armies left scars that extended far beyond the battlefield, scars that marked the fate of nations and the memory of those who lived through one of the war's lesser-known, yet pivotal struggles.